Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ben. I'm Communications Director at ELNET Israel. It's very nice to be here this evening here in Israel with you. So we are today meeting at a pivotal moment in the weeks following President Trump's mid-October peace plan, the agreement that brought an end to 2 years of war between Israel and Hamas. The region continues to evolve on fragile ground. Israel has witnessed the historic return of almost all of its hostages. Against this backdrop, Ankara's posture has raised urgent questions. Turkey surprised many by stepping into the US-brokered peace framework, even as its rhetoric, alliances, and ambitions reveal a far more complex game. So today, one of the questions we'll try to answer to will be, what is Ankara's true interest? And as today's topic reminds us, is Turkey the new regional threat to Israel? To better understand this issue and explore the nuances behind this question, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Rémi Daniel, who's here with us, one of the leading experts on Turkey and head of the Europe Research Program at the INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. He holds a PhD in international relations from the Hebrew University, and is set to publish his forthcoming book titled Turkish-Israeli Relations, 1960 to 1971, Democratization, Asymmetry, and Regional Crisis, to be published in 2026. Beyond his academic expertise, Dr. Daniel also serves as a platoon sergeant in the 8119th Infantry Battalion and has spent over 300 days in IDF service since October 7th, much of it in Gaza. We're deeply grateful for his expertise and for his service. Dr. Daniel, thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good evening, and thank you for your invitation for two main reasons. First of all, as you said, I'm now working more and more on Europe for the INSS, and every time we organize a trip to Europe, as it was the case actually last week, we see the very efficient, sometimes discreet, sometimes less, but always very efficient presence of ELNET in key places in Europe. And also thank you, because I think that the issue of Turkey is not only very important for Israel, but it's also, I guess, it will be an important point of Israeli-European contacts. I think that after long years in which Israel and Europe didn't see the same thing regarding Iran, we are now in a position in which there is a greater agreement between two sides. But now we have another point of disagreement, and it's Turkey. And that's why I'm very happy to have the opportunity to answer your questions, Ben, and then questions of the audience on an issue that is very important both for Israel and for European-Israeli relations.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to it, looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us. So, Dr. Daniel, I'll jump straight to my questions. I'd be happy if you could elaborate a little bit on what happened following Turkey's, let's say, unexpected participation in Donald Trump's mid-October 2025 peace plan. How should we understand Ankara's strategic plan, calculus? And did Turkey join, as you think, a genuine partner for regional stability, or as a tactical move to expand influence while reducing pressure from Donald Trump, Washington?
Well, I think we should put it in the context of Turkey's position towards Gaza after October 7th. And the first thing that we have to say that Turkey has tried to be a relevant and influential actor on the Gaza issue since the beginning of the war in Gaza. And it has done very important efforts to do so, to be more important. First of all, it has sent a lot of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. In some months, Turkey was the country that sent the highest number of assistance to Gaza. It has also, of course, as you know, adopted a very hostile position to Israel, with the objective of actually becoming a leader in its hostility to Israel, to create a movement against Israel that would position Turkey as a key player surrounding the issue, the war, and its settlement. And for a long time, despite all of these efforts, the actual impact of Turkey on the developing of events was very, very limited. Because the US under Biden did not trust Erdogan, because Israel was very opposed to any Turkish involvement in the Gaza issue, for a long time, the countries that were seen as mediators were more Qatar and Egypt. So if we had had this talk maybe 6 months ago, we could have talked about a relative Turkish failure. A lot of efforts to be relevant, a lot of efforts to have an impact, and very little results on the ground as far as the Gaza issue is concerned. But there has been a huge change, and that's what you said with Trump's plan. It's part of better relations between President Trump and President Erdogan. Actually, it's part of a more general exchange. And it's also part of something that is actually a clear vision of Trump that to make Hamas accept a ceasefire agreement, you had to put pressure on the terrorist organization through both Qatar, that brings the finance to the organization, and Turkey, that was actually the logistic basis of the organization. So the positive side of that is that, as you said, we got the hostages back. It is quite clear now that we could not have Hamas signing the agreement and freeing the hostages without Turkey's involvement because of this double pressure I mentioned. But now that we are talking middle term and long term with the second phase of Trump's plan, we see that Turkey's presence is more something that is negative than something that is positive. Because Turkey's position on Israel has not changed after the ceasefire. We still see this strong hostility. We see a very strong Turkish willingness to be present in Gaza. We hear the Turkish government saying that it is preparing an army force ready to enter Gaza. We see Turkish flags appearing in a lot of places in Gaza, although there is no Turk there yet. Turkish organization enter Gaza and show Turkish flags everywhere. And this growing presence, where at a time when Turkey, you were asking if Turkey was a genuine peace mediator, that's what they will claim. But we have to be very clear on Turkish position on the situation in Gaza. Turkey is not a country defending the Palestinian or the Palestinian Authority. It is a country supporting Hamas. And whose support for Hamas has not changed after October 7th or after the ceasefire. And it sees its role in the Gaza Strip as maintaining Hamas relevant and limiting Israel's capacity of striking the organization. And therefore, the new involvement, Turkey, this success through the Trump's plan of Turkey in being impactful and influential in Gaza bears with it a lot of dilemmas and even threats for Israel.
Thank you. Interesting. So basically, let's to try and get a greater perspective, maybe a macro perspective on this situation. Let's zoom out and try and think and talk NATO. So we know that Turkey remains a NATO member, yet we know that its military behavior, its alliances, and its ideological posture often diverge from NATO rules, norms, etc. So to what extent does Ankara still act as a reliable ally within the alliance? And where does its NATO membership shield it from consequences for destabilizing actions in the Middle East?
I think that's a key question because a lot of Israelis, I would say, misunderstand the impact of NATO on Turkey. They think that NATO moderates Turkey's position because of the alliance. And actually, NATO is one of the longest running alliance in history, but it is based also on the fact that it is based only on unanimity, on consensus. It means that it has no possibility to impose policy on one of its members. And I think Turkey understood it very well. And actually, NATO serves more as a leverage for Turkey than as a way to limit Turkey's uh, uh, bad behavior, if you say so, or any assertive policy, even against NATO members like Greece, for example. And what we see actually in the context of NATO and Turkey is that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Turkey's relation with NATO members have changed in the sense that it has made Ankara so important for NATO member countries that they have changed their position regarding Turkey. The first wave of that was when NATO wanted Sweden and Finland to join, and has any other NATO decision, this needed an unanimous approval of NATO members. At that time, if you remember, relations between NATO and Turkey were bad because Turkey was too close to Russia, even buying S-400 from Russia, that was very much against NATO rules, and because of its attitude also in northern Syria. You had a lot of NATO countries that had decided on embargoes against Turkey. When Turkey became necessary to get Sweden and Finland in NATO, these countries have reversed their position towards Turkey, and it was the first smoothing of the relations between Turkey and its allies, including actually the Biden administration. I think in this context, the Trump administration also changed things, and as such as it made Europeans more worried about their own security, with this idea that the US would be less involved in Europe's security. Turkey, which is, I just want to recall it, NATO's second army in terms of uh, of numbers, like quality is maybe different in terms of quantity of soldiers. Turkey is NATO's second army, and Turkey's defense industry that is flourishing. All that have become assets for NATO and for the European countries in particular that have made Turkey necessary for Europe's security. And we see that European countries in particular have been ready to forgive Turkey for its attitude, both domestically, by the way, Erdogan for its attitude against its own opposition, and Turkey for its regional attitude. And it's very clear also regarding Hamas, for example, that is unanimously, apart from Turkey, everyone agrees that a solution to the war in Gaza and to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict must go through disarmament of Hamas and the end of its rule. Turkey is the only one in the alliance with its rule, but so far it has not paid any political price within the NATO alliance, and also we must say within its relations with the United States. There is also a very strong Erdogan-Trump relation that shields Turkey from, let's say, political fine for its attitude towards Israel. So we are actually in a global context in which Turkey, if you compare it, for example, with the situation it was in 5 years ago when it felt isolated in frictions with the US, frictions with Europe, the war in Ukraine, the election of Donald Trump have changed the global reality so much that actually Turkey was one of the main beneficiaries, and Erdogan has understood it very well and is now leveraging it against the US, Europe, and Israel.
Um, you were just talking about the massive change that the election of Donald Trump also caused. That will take me to the post ceasefire, recent ceasefire that was just agreed upon. So since that ceasefire, Turkey and Israel have partially, I'm saying partially, reopened diplomatic channels. But profound mistrust remains, something President Erdogan makes sure to remind us of every now and then with some of his publications and online tweets. So what trajectory do you anticipate for Turkish-Israeli relations in the short term, and what structural factors could either deepen cooperation or drive the two states back toward a potential confrontation?
So actually, I'm not sure that the ceasefire was such a turning point in Turkish-Israeli relations. Actually, we are, first of all, maybe word of context, we are maybe at the lowest point in Turkish-Israeli relations. It is true that we are at the lowest point we have been in 40 years, but maybe even from the beginning of the relations between the two countries in 1949, never has there been such hostility from Turkey towards Israel. And we must also say that no country around the world has gone so far against Israel since October 7th. You had, on the one hand, countries that did not have any relations with Israel and remained hostile, Iran, or for example, or Algeria. You had then countries that had relations with Israel that either didn't change them or downgraded them a little. Europe and countries in Northern and Southern America. But Turkey was the country that went the furthest. It had very good trade relations with Israel and decided on a full embargo with Israel. And seeing, for example, that Israel was able to go around Turkey through third countries, for example, it has adopted a series of new rules to prevent that from happening. For example, in I think 2 weeks ago, Ankara's government decided that there would be no export of products from Turkey with Hebrew writing in it, to be sure that no Turkish product can reach Israel ever. So we have, of course, Turkey also joined any legal procedures against Israel when it could. It cannot always because part of the institutions, Turkey does not recognize them. And you mentioned Erdogan's very hostile tweets. And we must say that the ceasefire had no impact, and we can see it in one way. Maybe you see that international arrest mandates were sent by Istanbul's district attorney 2 weeks after the ceasefire against Netanyahu and other Israeli officials, accusing them of genocide and crime against humanity. And since no one thinks that the district attorney in Istanbul is independent, I think it's a clear signal sent by Turkey to Israel saying, no, our problem with you is not the fighting in Gaza, it's much deeper, and the ceasefire doesn't solve anything. So that's very, very worrying. Now, what is more worrying is that I told you that the trade relations between the two countries were very good before October 7th. And actually, the last decade of relations between Turkey and Israel had not been very, very stable.
Yeah.
We had a lot of ups and downs, but we had one channel that had sustained any political crisis, and it was trade. Now, with this Turkish decision to have a full embargo with Israel, this channel is also closed. And that's a very dangerous thing because actually it is now very difficult to see what are the actual threads bringing Turkey and Israel together, or what are the domestic audiences interested in good relations with Israel. Of course, businessmen are keen to renew this trade, but the longer the trade embargo lasts, the lighter it is for Israeli businessmen and Turkish businessmen to find alternatives to each other. So even when a Turkish government is ready to have better relations with Israel, it will be difficult to rebuild them. The only, I would say, things that are maybe more positive are that first, we must mention Syria here. And when the Assad regime fell and rebels supported by Turkey took power in Damascus, a lot of people said Syria will become a front of frictions, at least between Turkey and Israel. Because now, at this time where the tensions between the two countries are at the highest point, they are in almost direct contact in Syria. And what we saw is that actually we can manage the situation in Syria. We have not seen the direct frictions that the most pessimistic people had expected, because we have still these channels, security apparatus that know to talk to each other. We have also countries that can serve as mediators between the two countries, the United States, of course, Azerbaijan, and they create ways to manage tensions between the two countries. So, to summarize, the situation is very bad. I'm not very optimistic either. And by the way, I don't think the problem now in Turkey is only Erdogan. I think the hostility to Israel is something that has become mainstream in Turkey. But so I'm not very optimistic, but I'm not, I do see ways in which we can manage the relations between Turkey and Israel, also because of a certain Turkish ambiguity. Erdogan, for example, in part of his statement, does not give any legitimacy to Israel to live as a Jewish state. But the official position of the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs is still a two-state solution. And when he talks about a Palestinian state, it's only within the 1967 borders. So because Turkey is also trying to navigate its own position, there are ways to find a modus vivendi with Turkey. I'm not sure there is much better than that to expect in the short term.
That's perfect. You're making the transition for me. So, apropos modus vivendi, we are the European Leadership Network. Europe, what about Europe? So, given Europe's long and complicated relationship with Ankara, from migration agreements to defense cooperation and energy corridors, does the EU have any meaningful leverage if Turkey crosses red lines in the Middle East, or has Ankara effectively protected itself from any type of European pressure or leverage?
So I think this link to the answer I gave regarding on your question on NATO, it is very, very clear that I will be very keen with you. I think even the Middle East issue as a whole is not on the top three priorities of Europe right now. Right now, and Turkey is even below that. I think that the war in Ukraine has strengthened Turkey because it is a security partner with this army and defense industry. It is also key in trade with Asia, with the Russian tradeway closed because of the war in Ukraine. Now a way going through Turkey has become more important because of the trade war with China. Turkish industry has become more important. And we see actually that the European leaders that were much keener to punish Turkey for either infringement of human rights or democracy, or its attitude in the region, in Syria, for example, it is very striking to see how silent they have been regarding Turkey's support for Hamas, Turkey's support for Iran against Israel, and its general activities. Like, I think it is also very clear that Turkey is one of the actors that is actively trying to influence European public debate. We talk about Qatar, we talk about Iran, we talk about Russia. The interesting thing is that Turkey has understood the importance of these tools and has been very much active in creating for itself, with the RT word, for example, ways to influence in its favor European public debate. And we don't see any reaction of European leaders at all, at all. And Turkey is getting extreme on all these issues. Let's maybe remind here that the mayor of Istanbul has been sitting in prison for 8 months, and no European leader has said anything about it. The position of Turkey regarding Israel is very clear. And we see, on the contrary, European leaders queuing to visit Turkey. We saw Chancellor Merz, we saw Prime Minister Starmer, both of them actually signing an agreement to give Eurofighters to Turkey, something that the Germans had blocked until then because of the situation of human rights in Turkey. The situation of human rights in Turkey has deteriorated. Germany's veto has disappeared. So, and it is very clear in the context we have with our European partners that they are not seeing Turkey as a threat as Israel does it. And even more than that, I talked about the signing of Eurofighters. We'll see also future cooperation between the Turkish defense industry and the UK defense industry, more with the Italian defense industry. So actually, I think there is a very worrying trend from this point of view, with Europe just giving up on trying to get Turkey closer. The only exception is Greece and the Republic of Cyprus for very clear historical reason. But even on that, for example, you see that there is a special fund called SAFE on defense industry. And almost all members of the EU push for Turkey to be integrated within this fund, which would mean actually European taxpayers' money paying for the development of Turkish defense industry. And only Greece and Cyprus succeeded in blocking that. So actually, we see European leaders feeling too weak, having to deal with too many issues to be strong against Turkey. And that creates, first of all, Erdogan is very, very aware of these balances of power. And that is worrying for Israel to have actually so few allies when dealing with the rising Turkish claims.
Thank you. Sounds promising. Now, I guess I'll end with that final question of mine, at least, the one that we're all asking ourselves. Is Ankara on the trajectory that could eventually mirror, not trying to compare like with like, but mirror Iran's regional destabilization role, or are these two threats fundamentally different in nature? And basically, if you could answer the question of the question of today, do you see Turkey as a new regional threat to Israel? Period.
So generally in Israel now, the debate is Turkey the new Iran for Israel? And I don't think so. My answer is I don't think so. First of all, I told you about the ambiguity of Turkish position towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Although we see a lot of statements coming from either Turkish official or Turkish official media delegitimizing Israel as a wall or as a Jewish state, the position of Turkey is still to recognize the state of Israel once and to push for a Palestinian state that would be side by side with the Israeli state. And that's a huge difference compared to Iran that puts the destruction of Israel at the center, not only of its regional strategy, but of the regime's existence and raison d'etre. So I think that's a big difference. But if the question and the second thing is that we have also channels with Iran, with Turkey that we don't have with Iran, either direct and let's also say that the last attempt at normalization was not that far away. Actually, if you remember, the handshake between Netanyahu and Erdogan is September 2023. So that's a symbolic thing, but it came after 2 years of normalization that reopened channels. Part of them, of course, have been closed by the current crisis. Part of them, we see them working, for example, as I said, in Syria. And the existence of these channels of third countries that are Azerbaijan and the US makes the situation different because the two countries can still talk rather directly with each other. Regarding the issue of regional threat, it is clear that Erdogan, and also by a certain chance, because I don't think he claims he expected it, but I don't think he expected Assad to fall that quickly or that easily. and his allies to get on Syria. But if you look at what happened, and actually the last year, we see Turkey, first of all, getting very close to Israel, both in the north and maybe in Gaza. You see Turkey remaining very hostile to Israel, despite everything, and still trying to have a, a specifically hostile position to Israel. Because even if you look at the position of the Saudis and the Egyptians and the UAE and Jordan, they are all countries that are against Hamas. Turkey is pro-Hamas and very, very openly so. And you have so a country that is closer, that is as hostile as ever, and that is as strong as ever. Because of the good relations with the US, because of the relative weakness of Europe, because of the fact that no one really wants to stop Turkey right now, Turkey has become a very problematic country to deal with, and in a certain way, a threat. Especially, and maybe it will be my last remark on that, because Turkey sees the region as being in a competition between itself, Iran, and Israel. And when it saw what happened during the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, first of all, it decided to get closer to Iran to balance Israel's perceived strengthening. And also, because it saw the impact of Israel air force superiority, it has decided to double down on its own efforts to develop missiles and to get jet fighters. And in this context, the talks with the Europeans against Eurofighters are worrying, but Eurofighters are not as good as F-35. If President Trump and then the Congress agree on giving Turkey F-35, it would mean a very different thing. But Turkey, what I want to say with that is that Turkey is also a regional threat because it reads the region in terms of competition with Israel. And that's something that is worrying. The only positive thing I could see in that, and we don't see that so far, is that Iran, as a regional threat, was also instrumental in getting Gulf countries, for example, closer to Israel. And the question is, will Turkey's ambition also serve as a way to bring Israel closer to other countries? We see that already in the Eastern Mediterranean, Greece and Cyprus, renewing relations in the last weeks. So far, all the countries of the region, and especially Arab countries, are waiting to see the reaction of Donald Trump and its, I would say, balance between Ankara and Jerusalem. But that's something we have to work about. Really, I don't think that Israel, especially in the current regional and global configuration, has the mean to block Ankara's ambition. It can work only through alliances and alignments, but Israel has not full control about that. It will depend on, first, the relative perception of Ankara's threats by other countries and the positioning of the US. And that is what we have to follow if we want to assess regional balances, especially between Turkey and Israel.
So the first question I have here is from Mr. John Mirish. So how can Israel push back against Turkey's anti-Israel Islamist government? Should Israel increase its support for the Kurds? When there are a couple of them. So you know what? Maybe let's do a one by one. So I'll repeat. How can Israel push back against Turkey's anti-Israel Islamist government?
So I will answer to the two of these questions. Okay. No, first of all, the question is the question domestic? The question is, should Israel talk to the opposition in Turkey, for example, because it may be a better partner for discussion than the current Islamic government? I would say that even on that, our hopes must be limited. It is true, for example, that part of the opposition criticizes Erdogan for supporting the Hamas because they see in it what it is, an Islamist terror group. but it doesn't mean that they are not hostile to Israel. I think that the narrative of Israel committing a genocide against innocent Palestinians in Gaza is the leading narrative in Turkish society, including within the opposition. And for example, I mentioned the fact that the mayor of Istanbul has been in prison for 8 months. In one of the demonstrations against to free him from prison, the head of his party, the CHP, the main opposition party, wore a Palestinian flag. So I was thinking, they have other problems to deal with. That their main politician, the future candidate against Erdogan, the mayor of the biggest city in the country, sits in prison. If you demonstrate against this process, you don't have maybe to mention the Palestinian issue, but the Palestinian issue is so important in Turkey that it's now the situation. Regarding the support for the Kurds, it is a very interesting question because it is always mentioned that if he supports the terrorist group that attacks us, let's support the terrorist group that attacks Turkey. I don't think it's a very intelligent. No, I don't think it is the solution. First of all, historically, if you look at the situation in the 1990s, actually, Israel helped Turkey fight the PKK, the Kurdish terrorist group in Turkey, because actually this was a common threat. The Kurdish movement in Turkey is a leftist Marxist group that actually learned to fight in Palestinian camps in Jordan. That's how. That's the link between the two is so strong that they actually fought together. And some of the Kurdish leaders learned to fight against the Israeli army. And it is still very strong. The Kurdish issue is a complex one because also Kurds are divided within groups. You know that some groups in Iraq, the leading groups in Iraq are more conservative. These are the one which Israel has better contact, and the Kurds in Syria and in Turkey are more hostile to Israel historically. In the last years, they have adopted a more moderate tone regarding Israel, especially because they want to get Israel support. I think Israel has enough problem in the region for not entering these conflicts. First, because I think Turkey would feel it very, very quickly, and it will only bring uh, tensions between Turkey and Israel. I don't think Israel from far away can have an impact on the fight between Turkey and the Kurdish terrorist groups. Second, there is now a peace process between the Turkish government and these Kurdish groups so that any Israeli involvement would be presented as a way to destabilize the region. And third, it is also linked to the situation in Syria. If Israel supports the Kurds in Syria or in Turkey, it could also create problem for the new Syrian regime that has, and we had a reminder of this a few hours ago, the backing of President Trump. So Israel, I think, should not enter the Kurdish issue and not play the Kurdish card against Turkey because the situation there is too complex and because it could have only negative uh, uh, negative impact on the relations with Turkey, but it could try and explain Turkey that has been dealing with its own terrorist threat. It could create a stronger parallel between this threat and Hamas to convince the more moderate Turks of the danger of Hamas.
Um, so, continuation to this question, do you think that Israel should try to work with the secular pro-democracy forces within Turkey who also oppose Erdogan, or how do you see they can do that? They can counter that best together potentially.
So as I said, I've already answered this question actually. So I said the secular
The secular
position
ones.
in
Okay,
Turkey
great.
is not pro-Israeli. I would just add something, which is that there was a time when some ministers in Israel who don't understand Turkey well enough, and which did not prevent them from tweeted open support for the opposition in Turkey. and that's completely backfired. In a country in which conspiracy theories are a very important part of the public narrative, and in which Erdogan accuses his enemy of being collaborators of foreign powers, having the open support of an Israeli minister is actually something negative. And supporting the opposition openly is actually strengthening the government and giving the government tools to attack the opposition. So I think that the domestic situation in Turkey is something that Israel should not be involved in. It should hope for another government, because it is true that Erdogan is the worst mix of nationalism and Islamist rhetoric. So if the secular opposition was to come to power in Turkey, which seems rather unlikely now that Erdogan is striking it in a stronger way than ever, but if the opposition was to win the elections in Turkey, it would maybe open a very narrow window of opportunity, but we should not be either too optimistic or too confident in the ways Israel can have an actual influence on that.
Okay, and maybe one final question. Let's be hopeful. Let's try and look towards the future with a little bit of hope, through ambiguity and everything. Do you can you is there something that you're hopeful for, and that we can expect can be fruitful for the for between Israel and Turkey maybe so far, and maybe something positive that you can share with us?
So first, the fact that the relations were not severed is a good sign. I think that in a certain way we are at the lowest point of relations between Turkey and Israel, and these relations still exist. They are very bad. They are very bad. The tensions are numerous, but Turkey still recognizes the state of Israel, still has an embassy in Israel, although with very low diplomatic representation. So and that's the first optimistic thing. I think that if we are leaving the lowest point in Turkish-Israeli relations, which is the case, and we have like all, they are going through the highest shock they could have lived through, which is on the one hand a very violent regional crisis at a time where the power in Turkey is at the hands of a most extreme Islamic ruler. We see that actually it's very bad, but it's still existent. It cannot be completely destroyed. And the second thing is what I said about Syria. I think that Syria is still a good surprise in the fact that despite diverging interests, the two countries can reach a tacit agreement between them on how to deal with things. And the hope would be to have that on other things. But this once again, I think that to be more optimistic, I think one of the first things Israel has to do is to find allies to limit Turkish ambitions. These allies, they are in Washington, they are in Cairo, they are in Abu Dhabi, in Athens, and I think that that's the good way to deal with Turkey is not to deal with Turkey alone. And I think that that must be a series of steps. First of all, and it's linked to what Sally said, first of all, restore Israel's political and diplomatic strength by building an island of like-minded states, and then approach Turkey when it knows that all of its ambition will not happen and that there are countries really ready to contain it. And then we would see an improvement, I guess, in the management of the relations. Once again, I cannot be too optimistic regarding Turkey because I must say that I could not think that it would go so far unresponded also by by no European or American countries. But now that the situation in the Middle East is changing once again. I think there are real opportunities for the Israeli government, let's say around Turkey more than with Turkey, but it can be a political process that, if we have the patience and the intelligence to lead it, could have very important political fruits.
Thank you so very much for these insightful answers and everything. And on a personal note, it's been a great pleasure and honor to moderate this. We met together 10 years ago at the university when we fought against anti-Semitism together. So great to see you here. And now I'll just leave the floor.